Hello friends, we've been running this series on poetry, particularly focused upon the European and American poetry for some time, and in the series today we have the poet Maya Angelou, the American poet, and she is doubly blessed, I say, because it's a black and it's a woman. And if it is the combination is of being black and a woman, then of course you would think that the voice is going to be distinct and the voice is going to be interventionist. So with these 2-3 words in mind, I expect Professor Richa Bajaj to elaborate things from that angle and see whether this kind of poetry would today gel with the audience, because it is a turbulent world. It's a world that is against the blacks generally, against women also, at least critical of them, and therefore when we have such a voice, then we have to take note of it. We should try to understand the point, and then we should also try to make sense of what the poet is doing. So I request now Professor Bajaj, who teaches English in Hindu College, University of Delhi, and she is an expert in certain areas, specifically literary theory and Indian writing in English, and here she is to speak on Maya Angelou, the American poet. So over to you, Professor Bajaj.
Yeah, thank you, Professor Prakash. And I'm glad you said that she's doubly blessed, because that's what she actually says in one of her interviews. She says that, I'm glad that I'm born a woman and a black woman. So I think you've very much captured the essence of her poetry, because in her, her black American woman identity, I think is very strong in her works, and that is what defines much of her writing. We have to also remember that Maya Angelou, because her dates are from 1928 onwards, so of course we are in a phase of reconstruction now and rehabilitation of the blacks that took place at the end of the 19th century. At the end of the 19th century. So in the 20th century, you have this particular period which is, often referred to as the Jim Crow period. Now, she grew up in the Deep South in America, and we know the Deep South is actually known for its racial segregations, and it is here then that this kind of oppression and exploitation of the black people occurred. So the Deep South actually also exercised and practiced this kind of, had put in place these laws which racially segregated the blacks from the whites. So she grew up in this kind of a scenario, and in Arkansas in the 1930s during the Jim Crow period, the South period, which was again, as I said, where local laws were enforced that didn't allow, actually these laws were put in place that made it illegal for the black people, black Americans, for instance, to ride in buses, in the front of the buses. They were not allowed to eat in white-only restaurants, and they could not attend white schools, so they were black schools. So the idea used to be equal but separate. So how do you practice equality if you are if you want to keep it separate? So so she grew up in this period where politically the blacks had rights, but also states had their own laws, and these laws, while they thought that blacks were equal within quotes, they always kept them separate. So there were separate schools for the black people, and these laws were then repealed in 1965 or so, which is when you have the civil rights movement. Now, Maya Angelou is also a civil rights activist. She was working was strongly in touch with the leaders of the time who were working towards repealing these laws and bringing about, for instance, interracial marriages and freedom to be in any restaurants, and just freedom of movement and expression. So I think she's she, because of her upbringing, and also some of her personal details have contributed to this kind of a resilient, strong woman that she becomes, that we see in much of her works, because she was brought up by her paternal grandmother, who was actually quite a stoic woman. She was Christian, stoic, and she tried to instill these ideas in her. Of course, Maya Angelou as a young girl would question her grandmother. Why are you bearing with these white men who misbehave with you when you own the land? Because you see, it's not the 19th century. The black people have been able to, because of their work ethic, they've been able to create a kind of a living ecosystem for themselves. And even then, when they have whites barge in, they're constantly under threat. And she tells this young Maya that, you don't know any day they're going to just kill you with a bullet. So there is a sense of fear that continues in the 20th century, even when the battle has been fought. So, but I think Maya Angelou took a lot of these, attributes of her grandmother, of this strong woman who never gave up and was never defeated, even when there is adversity around you. And this is a recurrent strain, I think, in her poetry as well. This sense of resilience that she took from her grandmother. But she was also a victim of sexual assault and violence, because as early as when she was 8, she was actually assaulted by her mother's boyfriend or partner. And this traumatic incident actually left a deep impact on her and scarred her for the next coming years, because she mentions in her autobiography that she had stopped speaking, and she went mute for 6 years or so, because this man went scot free. He wasn't punished. I mean, even when the family got to know about him, and then he was one day found to be murdered. So Maya Angelou actually held herself responsible for it, because she thought that because she had told her family about it, therefore that man was killed. So there is a sense of mixed sort of, childhood trauma, basically, where there is guilt, where there is fear, and all of that mixed together. So this kind of a thing also remained with her, that how as a marginalized subject, as a woman who's to do, as a growing up girl, the kind of challenges that she had to face. So I think all these, and how she overcame all of those, these I think made her into this kind of a very strong, resilient woman, or a voice in the 20th century. That's how I'd like to introduce her as a person. But and even when she grew up, so she was living in this rural area which was cut off from the city life. While her parents were in the city, she was living with the grandmother. But when she grew up, really, she went to stay with her mother. And during this period in California, when she, this was around the outbreak of the Second World War, around that period, when she's not even 16, or she's a 14-15-year-old girl, and she tries to she gets into a school there, but also involves herself in various activities at the time. She also tries to get some odd jobs to make a living, in her early adult life. And she works as as a singer, as a dancer, as a cook at some place. So she was basically taking up these different jobs to make a living, till she actually, I think, found her feet when she joined the Harlem Writers Guild. And this is where she met a lot of literary writers. And so her literary career sort of begins much later in her life, when she meets all these like-minded people who had been writing literary stuff, and she becomes involved in the Civil War not the Civil War movement, I mean the Civil Rights movement of the 1960s. It is this period when she actually begins to write properly. And so she's this kind of multifaceted personality who's an actor. She's written plays, she's also produced movies, she's been an actor in certain movies. So she's an actor, singer, dancer, essay writer, or memorist, and also a poet. So today, of course, I'm looking at Maya Angelou as a poet more than anything else. And she's the author of 7 autobiographies, and each phase of her life she's been able to capture very well in these autobiographies. The first of her autobiography, for which she became really famous, was I Know Why the Caged Bird Sings. And this was in 1969, after she's been in touch with these Harlem literary Renaissance people. So, and there are several volumes of poetry then that follow later on. Just to give you some of them, Just Give Me a Cool Drink of Water Before I Die came out in 1971, and Still I Rise, her very famous poem, is from this collection, and I'll be discussing that as well, which was in 1978. I Shall Not Be Moved in 1990, and so on and so forth. So you have these collections of poetry that she's written alongside autobiographical works that she kept writing till the very end. In fact, just before her death in 2014, just a year before that, she came out with the publication of another of her phase of autobiography, where and she wanted to work on her associations with world leaders, etc. So till the end of her life, she continued to write, and that became her project, sort of a writing project. Even though she did not complete her college degrees, she was actually honored with a lot of degrees, honorary degrees and awards by various institutions and universities. She was actually awarded also professorship of American Studies at Wake Forest University in 1982, and then on she won a lot of awards also. She's in fact only the second poet in America after Robert Frost to give to recite a poem at the inauguration ceremony of a US president, and that she did for Bill Clinton in 1993, and that added to her fame. She's obviously then, since then on, she's she's received the Medal of Freedom prize from Obama, and these kind of things. So she's become a sort of a renowned figure in Black American lives now, and known for her autobiography and her poetry equally. Her poems are all over university syllabus, and they are read out, recited, because she was a singer and had a sense of rhythm. So often she recited her own poems very well. So in fact, if you want to read Maya Angelou's poems, I'd suggest that you actually go and listen to her recitation and see how she recites her own poetry, because there is a sense of rhythm that she's able to capture in her poems, and therefore her poetry is very lyrical.
One query that particularly occurs to me, and I want to make it, is whether her poetry or her poetic persona is more or less entirely political. She is writing for the society in which she lives, and she is commenting on that. And personal experiences also, in that sense, reflect her sense of protest.
Yes,
Would you agree?
That is true. I agree, because in fact, she says that her poetry is actually very personal and introspective and intimate, where she's talking about nature of love, in some cases, men, so she takes very ordinary subjects also as her poems, and she's written so many of her poems of that, there are some of them are very overtly political, such as Africa, where she's personified Africa as the woman, and Africa as the colony, and Africa as woman. So there are those overtly political ones also, but then there are very intimate personal ones where she's talking about her experience of love or experience of loss, but then I feel that the personal experience turns into a kind of a political discourse in her poetry, because she is able to spread the net wide, moving her own situation becomes everybody else's situation. And so the intimate details that exist, especially the first part of her autobiography, where she's talking about that kind of violence done to her body as a young girl of 8 by a man. I think to be able to speak about these this kind of exploitation is and the torture involved there is in itself very courageous and political. So to be able to do that in the 1960s, to tell the world what she's gone through as a young girl and talk about her childhood trauma, is itself I think political. I think so. A lot of her personal experiences that you see are in fact political. Most of her poems I think therefore are either overtly or otherwise political in nature. Even when they deal with themes of memory, for instance, loss at some point, love, there is always a comment which is ideological in nature, and which so she doesn't shy away from taking sides, in the sense that and she speaks very plainly and straightforwardly in that sense. So even when there are images that she draws from life, she doesn't, when it comes to statement, then there are a lot of statements in her poetry as well. So she will make a lot of statements even when she builds these images. Like for instance, in one of the poems, which is Caged Bird, which I'll discuss, she talks about the image of a caged bird and a free bird. Right now, the images are clear that there is a free bird and the caged bird, but then she goes on to talk about that how the caged bird is, how the caged birds, the bird's wings are clipped and the feet are tied. Right. So in a way, the image is expanded, but then she also makes it a point to say that the caged bird sings of freedom. right? So there are these themes such as freedom, social justice, equality, that she time and again brings up in her poems. And you'll see that actually maybe I can just read out to you one of those poems, which is called Equality. Very
I think
interesting.
that will give a very
Give a
good
sense
example
of rhythm also, and also that it's titled Equality. Right, and I'll just read from there. It doesn't begin, but it's just taken from the middle. I quote, "Take the blinders from your vision, take the padding from your ears, and confess you've heard me crying, and admit you've seen my tears. Hear the tempo so compelling, hear the blood throb in my veins. Yes, my drums are beating nightly, and the rhythms never change. Equality, and I will be free." Unquote.
It's a great kind of a riddle, that equality is free.
Yes, right.
How does one, explain this
Right.
in
That
prosaic terms?
so the idea that that freedom and equality, are they the same or are they different? And the idea that the first thing that she is asking the world to do, and now again you could read it as a feminist poem, that she is telling, as a woman, she is telling men to take the blinders from your vision, because you can't see it, you can't see my pain, you can't hear my cries. So first take the blinders of from your vision, and take the padding from your ears. It could also be for the black subjectivity or a black persona speaking to the whites, so both these angles exist there. And confess you've heard me crying. It's your negation, it's the obliteration of, that you obliterate somebody's pain, and you refuse to even see it and to accept that you see it. So because, and then you think that there is nothing wrong with the world. So she says, confess you've heard me crying. And admit that you've seen my tears, because
and she insists.
Yes. Right. So very statement oriented. Even when there is an image, then there is a very strong statement that confess that you have seen me crying, and admit that you have seen my tears. And you can already see the anger. At one point she actually says, very interestingly, Maya Angelou in one of her interviews says that anger is healthy. She says bitterness will eat you up, but anger against social injustice is healthy. Yes. And she says anger is actually productive and creative, because she says this is important because it is healthy. It'll keep, it'll burn everything if required.
And she enters into a dialogue, and she is negating certain things that she might be hearing from the males.
Yes.
And therefore, she asserts her position, and she does it through the dialogue, I-you format, for instance.
Yes, she does that. And the I is therefore very pronounced here. And the rhythms, she says, will never change. Equality, and I will be free. Right? So the idea that if I have equal opportunities, if I have equal...
So equality is not free.
Yes.
Only she, with her intervention, will make it free.
But also equality is the way to freedom.
Yes.
Right? Freedom will come only when there is equality. So there is a sense of the precondition to freedom is, in her view, equality. So, and the poem is titled Equality in that sense. So you can see that how she, she makes those kind of statements in her poems. Also the poem, for instance, another one that she's also a person who talks about a kind of a universalism, but also a sense of humanism. And she, even when she, a lot of her works are feminist in nature, and I'll come to her feminist poetry in a bit. But before I do that, she talks about the theme of humanism in poems such as Alone, for instance. And in Alone, she's able to again call out the lies in society and the truths that she abides by. And she says, and I quote in Alone, it is again one of those early poems in 1975, she's written this. It goes as, I quote, "There are some millionaires with money they can't use. Their wives run around like banshees, their children sing the blues. They've got expensive doctors to cure their hearts of stone, but nobody, no nobody can make it out here alone. Now if you listen closely, I'll tell you what I know. Storm clouds are gathering, the wind is gonna blow. The race of man is suffering, and I can hear the moan. 'Cause nobody, but nobody can make it out here alone." That's unquote. So you can already see a sense of rhythm, song. It's so lyrical, you can actually sing it out, because she has a very strong sense of lyricism in her poetry, and very dialect, that 'cause nobody, but nobody can make it out here alone. So she uses even her poems, the titles of her poetry collections are very colloquial, almost like it's a statement and not like a very thought out phrase out there. So I think she's very direct in that sense, very lyrical in her works, and also pointed in her critique. Whether it is this here, that there are that you cannot make society alone, and that humanism is the way forward for her. And she sees herself as an individual in the battle, and a strong individual in that battle. She doesn't view herself as a delicate woman who needs protection. And this is an idea that she actually further talks about in a poem which is titled On Working White Liberals. And there she says, she poetically asserts this point, and I quote, "I don't ask the Foreign Legion or anyone to win my freedom or to fight my battle better than I can." Yeah, unquote. So you can already see, she's saying, I will fight my battle, and I'm not asking you to fight my battle better than I can. And then she says in the same poem, I quote, "Though there's one thing that I cry for, I believe enough to die for. That is every man's responsibility to man." What do you say?
No, basically, it's a very fine paradox that she's maintaining through the poem. For instance, she's talking about loneliness, and she doesn't want to be alone. At the same time, she says, but I'll fight my own battles.
Yes.
So this kind of paradox, that she wants to be a part of the crowd, but when she's a part of the crowd, then she's asserting herself as an individual.
Yes, that is certainly there. Also, the fact that she sees herself as not, she's basically saying, I will anyway fight my battles, but I want every man to take up the responsibility to man and fight for everyone else's battles as well.
She's for the social action.
Yes.
So people should rise, in revolt against something that is wrong and unjust.
Right.
So you can't do alone, you have to be together.
Right.
Yes.
So I think she believes in this kind of collective strength, and therefore, she was very much impressed by Martin Luther King Jr. and she was friends with James Baldwin. So all these people who were civil rights activists who worked to create a kind of a pressure on government so that these laws were repealed, as I mentioned, the Jim Crow laws, and how they were able to finally achieve equality for the black people. So I think even when she is talking about women-centric issues, she is also talking about an individual consciousness and an awareness about history that all individuals must have, and their roles and responsibility vis-a-vis their society.
So friends, with this introductory comment, Professor Bajaj has already laid the basis for a discussion about specific poems that she would have written, and that her power as a poet, her use of the phrase, the choice of the phrase, all that is very telling. So that will come out now in the following discussion, where individual poems or a poem would be taken to explicate and to interpret the poetic content that we have before us. Thank you.